Welcome, philosophers. Hope that you're well. I'm here back with another video. I hope that your fall semester in 2025 is going really well. I will probably post another video soon about the books that I read during the summer because the summer is over in terms of academia. Today, I come to you with Byung-Chul The Crisis of Narration. I think the preface is really amazing. Like every sentence, packs so much meaning, and it's relatively short. In this book, which published by Polity Press, the English translation, pretty recently, last year, 2024. So it's one of his newer books. And let's see, two, four, six, it has 10 chapters in it. So I'll read the preface, but chapter 1 is from narration to information. And you can kind of get like what the book is about listening to the titles. Chapter 2 is the poverty of experience. 3 is the narrated life. 4, bare life. 5, the disenchantment of the world. 6, from shocks to likes, kind of talking about social media. And, the disappearance of the other. The next chapter is theory as narrative, then narration as healing, which I think is a really interesting chapter, narrative community, and story selling instead of storytelling. And with this book, Han returns to his main themes of, achievement society, surveillance society. We're exploiting ourselves by in a way, trying to liberate ourselves from fetishized capitalism. We just become more embedded within it, trying to have freedom and not have the typical like 9 to 5 job, if that is even really a thing. I think most of us kind of work the entire day and then fall asleep at night to do it again the next day. With maybe even more than one job, or maybe being full-time as a student and having a job. But anyway, we want to get away from working for someone else by maybe being a content creator or having our own business, producing our own product, whatever it is. But then we are our own boss, which isn't as sort of wonderful as we might expect. We end up pushing ourselves harder and harder because of this promise of one day we'll be free and we'll live easily, and there will be more pleasure and less suffering, actual leisure time instead of just recovery from work. So, we still live in this society, and coupled or layered upon that for Byung-Chul is the technological aspect, the particular technology that we have today that we are addicted to, that we use to sort of doom scroll and binge watch and take all these selfies, etc. Like the fast pace of life, the atomization of life, the isolation that we have from each other. Like, this is the sort of dystopia, I think, that Han always creates in his world. And so, the angle that he's taking with this one is because this book is that, what does this society not create space for? It doesn't create space for Storytelling. So this book has a strong connection to my favorite book of his, The Disappearance of Rituals. Um, this talks about how storytelling requires patience, it requires an attention span, it requires us to be good listeners, and it offers, for the individual and for the collective, a way to connect our memories and select our memories and the events of our life to in a way that creates meaning and that helps us transcend our facticity. He says that, in one chapter, all of this focus on optimization and, tracking our sleep patterns, tracking our maybe heart rate, our calories, having all these planners, we are creating a database that represents who we are, but this doesn't have any narrative quality, and therefore, is it really a true reflection of, the human being, of the Homo sapien? So, yeah, that's just a sort of a brief summary of this book. What is the importance of myth? What is the importance of storytelling? And just personally, this book meant a lot to me because I'm teaching for the second time a world mythology class. And, I ask myself, what does it take to be a good storyteller? Because that's part of teaching world mythology, telling all of these stories and getting students involved and excited and talking about how we can interpret them and what we can gain from them. And in the historical context, and we're analyzing together, but sometimes there are classes where I'm just kind of telling stories and we're talking about it. Byung Han says, he says that, we have stories on Instagram, for instance, but these are ephemeral. They're not lasting. They don't really connect or create the kind of tension. Han focuses on tension, and the other a lot, transformation, like what does it take to create a relationship, to create an intimate connection, to create an experience of life and evolve and transform. Stories on Instagram do not offer the real benefits of like an ancient ritualistic mythological religious story, that we can pass down, that really speaks to more than one person, because it disappears quickly and also it just relays information. And I think there's a shadow side of storytelling too that can also enter into sort of the commodified, he says we are a community of consumers, which really isn't a community, sort of consumer life. And that is when, I was thinking about when content creators try to create a story. They have a certain aesthetic. They want to embody an archetype. They want to be a brand that tells you a story so you can get wrapped up in it. But I think that Han would see this as not true storytelling, because true storytelling is supposed to have a deeper meaning than just because, why are we doing that as content creators? Because, we want to be monetized or whatever it is. Okay, so let's start reading. This is just maybe 5 pages. He says, everyone is talking about narratives. Paradoxically, the inflation of narrative betrays a crisis of narration. So right there, I wonder what he means by that. Like, what are his examples? Who's talking about narrative? Maybe the stories we tell or we read on social media, the stories about the world, where it's going, progress, false, narratives, conspiracy theories, etc. A lot of times this is my question for Han, like, what world are you coming from? Because I wouldn't necessarily, like, I have to think about that. Really? Everyone is talking about narrative. So you let me know in the comments if you like see that in your world. At the heart of all the noise of storytelling, there is a narrative vacuum that expresses itself in a lack of meaning and orientation. So those are two elements of true storytelling. It gives you meaning and it orients you, it directs you, right? Like my students in world mythology this semester have to write a hero's journey. And so, they have to think about their lives or an event in their lives, a task, a challenge, with a beginning, middle, and end. And what does that, what benefit does that have? I think it helps you move forward. I think it helps you, like, without a vision, the people will perish, right? It gives you a vision, it clarifies, etc. Neither storytelling nor the narrative turn will be able to bring about the return of narration, which is what he wants. A paradigm becomes a topic and a fashionable object of academic research only when there is a deep-seated alienation from it. All the talk about narratives suggests their dysfunctionality. So, one thing that I think Han sets up is, one, a problem that he sees, a phenomenon that's problematic. Two, a caution that there's not going to be an easy answer, that there's not going to be an easy solution. He really doesn't provide a solution. He might imply it, but he also wants to say, watch out for false sort of solutions. As long as narratives were our anchor in being, that is, as long as they provided us with a site, turning being in the world to being at home. And he mentions this being at home several times in this book, and I think that's a really curious phrase. I want to think about more, like, what that means. By furnishing life with, and here we have a triad, meaning, support, and orientation. In other words, as long as living was a narrating, there was never any talk of storytelling or narration. This sets up a dichotomy between being/doing and talking about something, which reminds me of Kierkegaard's essay on this present age, where he talks about how people are just speaking superficially and they're raising a spectacle. Like if an alien came from another planet, they would think something big is about to happen, but nothing really big is about to happen. People are telling stories of being heroic, but then they're just skirting on the edge of like the iced over lake. They're not really plunging out into the middle. No one's really, he critiques his world as saying that there's all these advertisements and publications and talk and press, and journalistic ventures, but there's nothing that goes deep. And so that's what this makes me think of. And then also the phrase living was a narrating, like that's what, we can't just add storytelling to our lives. We have to live and embody the storytelling, I think Han is saying. And that makes me think of something that I read, this passage that I read, and I have to think about where it was. But someone was, dying on their deathbed, and someone was asking them, would you like to pray? And they responded, why would I pray now? My life is a prayer. And if anyone can tell me where that's from, like something that I read somewhat recently. And I thought that was really powerful. It might have been in my 365 Tao book. Like it might have been a little story in that. I don't know. The inflation in the use of such concepts begins precisely when narratives lose their original power, their gravitational force, their secret, and their magic. I think this is really interesting right here, this phrasing, and then it also reminds me of what Carl Jung says about like the Christian myth losing its power. Han mentions power, force, secret, and magic. And a little later, he's going to use the word spell. And I think, there's some other words that kind of fit in that sort of rhetoric, that pool of rhetoric, where it always makes me think that Han is being like he has a little bit of mysticism in him, like he has a nostalgia for the mysticism of the past, which I think is also in Heidegger. And as I was saying, like it just seems like sometimes Han, like what he really longs for, if you can get to like the person, the man that's there, he really wants to be enchanted. He longs for an enchanting, magical world, and don't we all? I have to pause super quickly because I'm making tea. Okay, where were we? Okay, so once they are seen as something constructed, they lose their moment of inner truth. So there's kind of also this desire for stories to be organic, to kind of unfold, to be a living being almost, as opposed to we're constructing it, we're manufacturing it for a use. Like I think he mentions Heidegger and equipment later on. They are no longer the source of what is binding, of what unites. This sort of sense of community and unification is important in Han. And interestingly enough, he starts to talk about how when you have a lack of narrative in society, people still, as human beings, we still long for it. We still long for narrative. But, so we're kind of these beings really deeply needing something, and there being like nothing out there for us. And he says something similar to what Hannah Arendt says in The Origins of Totalitarianism. What is the scene that is rife for fascism? And that would be just this situation right here, that we have a desire, there's nothing meeting that desire. And so this makes it really easy for, maybe harmful groups to come in who are willing to have a vision, who are willing to give you a vision. And why do maybe groups like, I don't know, you can think of maybe the harmful groups that are almost like kind of cultish or sending out maybe a problematic message. I don't know a lot about Andrew Tate, but he comes to mind for some reason. Or like Han talks about like conspiracy theories, like fringe movements really have the opportunity to come into this space and gather a lot of followers, for better or worse, because they're willing to meet the need. They're willing to be the leader. They're willing to be the archetype. They're willing to give you a system and a theory that's missing in society. So when Hannah Arendt talks about this in terms of, how like the Nazis moved in, she says that, the need then, or the solution, is to make sure we're always active and participatory, participant and political in a sense. We're not apathetic. We're not isolated and resentful and feeling like we're desperate. We are truly continually making sure that one of the most important things we do in society is create meaning in our lives already, so we don't have an empty kind of receptacle for someone to come in and sell us their version of meaning. Right? So I don't know. I think that it's really interesting, but I do keep wanting to ask, like, what I want to be convinced, that myth is this important, that story is that important. So, and I think that that's what Han's whole book is about, sort of showing us why it's important and the negative consequences of not having it. So I just mentioned that because, maybe put in the comments below, why do you agree? Do you think myth, storytelling, narration is important, and why? And do you agree with Han as well that our society is lacking in it? It doesn't create room for it because of the temporality and the what's valuable in our world today. Despite the present hype around narratives, we live in a post-narrative time. Narrative consciousness, which I think is an interesting phrase, allegedly rooted in the human brain, is a conception that is possible only in a post-narrative time, that is outside of the narrative spell. Religion is a typical narrative with an inner moment of truth. It narrates contingency away. Christian religion is a meta-narrative that reaches into every nook and cranny of life and anchors it in being. Time itself becomes freighted with narrative. In the Christian calendar, each day is meaningful. In the post-narrative era, the calendar is de-narrativized. It becomes a meaningless schedule of appointments. Religious holidays are highlights and high points of a narrative. Without a narrative, there are no festivities, no festive times. So it changes our ontology almost. No festive moods with their intensified feeling of being. All that is left are work and free time, production and consumption. In the post-narrative era, festivities are commercialized. They become events and spectacles. Rituals are also narrative practices. They are always embedded in a narrative context. As symbolic techniques for creating enclosure, they transform being in the world into a being at home. So when he mentions religion, I also think of Nietzsche saying God is dead, trying to, awaken all of the people to the consequences of what they've done. That's fine if we are transitioning from, say, just saying it really reductively, from religion to science, but think about then what science has to do to replace religion. We've just taken the grounding out, and how are we going to retain our footing? So, in the gay science, in the God is dead. Did I say God is not dead? I don't know. The God is dead section. He's trying to say that people don't realize the sort of the gravity of what they have done, right? And so, I think this would fit in this section right here. Also, I think about Marx, who talks about, what leisure time really is. It's supposed to be time for creativity and to follow our bliss and our passion. And we really need to have, be well rested and have good energy for that, and not to be so burnt out by our work. Otherwise, leisure time can't really exist. Leisure time is not just having time away from work. it is, and it's not the quantity of time, it's the quality of the time. A world-changing and world-opening narrative cannot be created by the whim of a single person. Rather, it owes its existence to a complex process in which various forces and actors are involved. So he's saying that this is going to take like an overhaul of who we are and where we've been heading. Ultimately, a narrative is an expression of the mood of a time. Such narratives which have an inner moment of truth are the opposite of the eviscerated, exchangeable, and contingent narratives, that is, the micro-narratives of the present, which lack gravity, which lack any moment of truth. So, when we're having a conversation, and he says a lot of times we're just exchanging information, or it's a transaction of some kind, one of the consequences of what Han would call the neoliberal regime, which I think of as like fetishized capitalism, would be that our priorities are just mixed up. It kills creativity when you have to please an audience, or you create for someone, or you create for the potential that you can receive payment from it. And I think that Han is asking for like a reevaluation of our values and priorities. What happens when instead of likes, fame, money, etc., we say, what truth is going to be disclosed because of our conversation, because of what we're thinking about and the reflection that we're putting out there, what connections can be made, something that's of a higher value, I think. How would that change our world? How would that change the content that's on social media, that's out there? How would it change our activities of the day and how our day is structured? Narration is a concluding form, and I haven't really mentioned this, but he talks a lot about in The Disappearance of Rituals how rituals create a true ending. He critiques this idea of, just having an eternal kind of task that never really ends, that never really has a break or a pause. He talks about like the lifelong student. Han would prefer us to have a time of learning and studying, and then we have our graduation, and then we do something else. And then we do something else. Like, these sort of rituals that create endings are also lacking from our society. And, why? Maybe because we don't have time for them, we don't think they're valuable. Our focus is continually accumulating more and more and more, whether that's materials or followers or money or whatever it is, publishing yet another book, and then at the end of it, like, what do you get? And I was thinking about this the other day, how we are finite beings, right? And I was thinking about this especially because, I came to philosophy later in life. I think about if I could have come to philosophy at 18, I would have a very linear path of getting my bachelor's in philosophy, and then master's and PhD, and then teaching and publishing, and there we go. But, now I'm not 18 and or in my 20s, and I am thinking about getting my PhD in philosophy. What happens if you don't discover your passion and bliss in the beginning of life? There's not thinking about like time. What time is there to do something? There's not really a lot of time. And so that makes me think and wonder if maybe our lives, our purpose on earth is not to do something because there's not time to do much. How many languages can you learn in a single incarnation life, etc. Like whatever your interests are. And so if there's not time to do, then maybe we have to rethink what life is about. There is too much time almost to be. If I think about being present, being like feeling life, I mean, we can do it in we can be, let's say, since we're contrasting it with doing, we can be an eternity in a second, in a millisecond. It's just a shift in our state of energy and a change of mind, a mind shift. So there's lots and lots of time to be if we can just pause and be still. So I don't know. Just my, thoughts. Narration is a concluding form. It creates a closed order that founds meaning and identity. In late modernity, which is characterized by opening up and unbounding, forms of concluding and closing off are increasingly eroded. At the same time, with increasing permissiveness comes a growing need for narrative forms of closure. Populist, nationalist, and right-wing extremist or tribal narratives, including conspiracy theories, cater to this need. So this is what I was talking about. This section made me think of Hannah Arendt. They are taken up because they offer meaning and identity. However, in the post-narrative era, with its intensifying experience of contingency, these narratives do not have any strong binding force. Narratives create a community. Storytelling, by contrast, brings forth only a fleeting community, the commodified form of community. These communities consist of consumers. So here, is a section or a part where I think Han needs to use an adjective. I don't think he is critiquing all storytelling. I think he's talking right here about the shadow side of storytelling, but there are no adjectives or descriptors to distinguish or discriminate the shadow side from the more enlightened side. So I think if anything can be confusing in Han, it can be that. Because, in other parts, he might talk about storytelling as positive. For instance, when he contrasts storytelling to story selling, where there is a truer, higher kind of storytelling. And so it can seem like he's contradicting himself, but he's really just assuming you'll get when he means something in a problematic way and when he means the same thing but in a positive way. Storytelling, by contrast, brings forth only a fleeting community, the commodified form of community. These communities consist of consumers. No amount of storytelling could recreate the fire around which humans gather to tell each other stories. That fire has long since burnt out. It has been replaced by the digital screen, which separates people as individual consumers. Consumers are lonely. They do not form a community, nor can the stories shared on social media fill the narrative vacuum. They are merely forms of pornographic self-presentation or self-promotion. Posting, liking, and sharing content are consumerist practices that intensify the narrative crisis. I think it's kind of funny, this scene, this vision I get in my mind of, the contrast between people around like a bonfire telling stories at night and just sitting there, like, I don't know, like in my experience, eating s'mores and drinking cerveza. But then, the individual, like a group of people, but individually and isolated in their own apartments or homes, dorm rooms, etc., staring, in a dark room at the glow of their laptops or phones or whatever it is. It's just an interesting kind of vision. And I mean, he describes this as pornographic. He takes this up a little later, and I think, various philosophers have talked about this. I don't know, I think a book by Badiou, The Pornographic Age, that I haven't read, but I think it probably is along the same lines of talking about it as, what characterizes it is a lack of mystery, a lack of eroticism, a sort of, Jean-Paul Sartre actually talks about it in Being and Nothingness when he talks about obscenity, that what is obscene is sort of isolating body parts and emphasizing body parts and giving them a life of their own apart from the human sort of body and, sort of more of a holistic story of desire and insecurity and fear, etc. I get when people are, sort of making the analogy. Through storytelling, capitalism appropriates the narrative and submits it to consumption. Storytelling produces narratives in a consumable form. It charges products with emotion. It promises unique experiences. We buy, sell, and consume narratives and emotions. Stories sell. Storytelling is story selling. And I think he is talking about how a true story or myth doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't explain. It leaves something to the imagination. It has spaces where, that make it timeless, because then people can sort of add their own interpretation and experiences to it. And so, Han is really critical about anything that is too accessible or too easy, too, what he says in his book about beauty, too smooth. Narration and information are counteracting forces. Information intensifies the experience of contingency, whereas narration reduces it by turning the accidental into necessity. Information lacks the solidity of being. Nicholas Luhmann puts it lucidly. Information's cosmology is not a cosmology of being, but of contingency. Being and information are mutually exclusive. A lack of being, a forgetfulness of being, is thus imminent to the information society. Information is additive and cumulative. It is not a bearer of sense, whereas a narration carries sense. The original meaning of sense is direction. Today, we are perfectly informed, but we lack orientation. Information also dissects time into a mere sequence of present moments. A narration, by contrast, brings forth a temporal continuum that is a story. So I think it's interesting when he talks about information, and I think looking up information versus reflection, which requires a lingering, a slowness, I think it is a big part of our lives. Like when we when we Google something, we're looking up information. We want to know. We want something that's logical and clear and quick and simplified. We want to know exactly what ingredient goes in this recipe. We want to know what might be the cause of our, illness that we've had. We want to know a fact. We want to sort of gather the propositions that can be true or false. And we have so much of this. I think Han is talking about the imbalance. How many of us sit down to journal or reflect or slow down? I always think about the difference between, I don't know if this how true this is. It's more of like just, I don't know, something people would tell me as a teenager. Um, and when I was going to Germany, kind of reiterated that. And it seemed true to me at the time that, when I was 16 in Germany with my family, we would have 3-hour lunches and all get together. And we would, it would be slow and there would be various stages to it. We would drink and then eat and then drink again and smoke and sing and tell stories. And it was like an event, it was a whole afternoon. Whereas I guess for some of us in the US, as quickly as we can like feed ourselves so we can continue to work, that's what, lunch would be. So it's just the difference of, I guess, temporality again. On the one hand, the informatization of society accelerates its de-narrativization. On the other, amid the tsunami of information, there arises a need for meaning, identity, and orientation. That is, a need to clear the thick forest of information in which we risk losing ourselves. The flood of ephemeral narratives, including conspiracy theories, and the tsunami of information are ultimately two sides of the same coin. Adrift in the sea of information and data, we seek a narrative anchor. We tell fewer and fewer stories in our everyday lives. Telling stories is in decline because communication takes the form of the exchange of information. So, a focus on efficiency. Scarcely any stories are told on social media. Stories unite people. Sorry, I knew I was going to sneeze. By promoting their capacity for empathy. They create genuine community. The loss of empathy in the age of the smartphone is a clear sign that this technology is not a medium for telling stories. Its technical I don't know this word. Dispositive? I've seen that word, but then I've never my mouth has never said it. I'll have to look that up later, is already a barrier to the telling of stories. Typing and swiping are not narrative gestures. So this is interesting because we talk about a lot in my classes. Is it technology, the smart technology specifically, that is problematic, or is it how we use it? And I think we usually end up saying, well, it's how we use it because there can be benefits. But so it's interesting, Han is like really going out on a limb here and saying, what this technology cannot do, no matter how you use it, it seems like he's saying, is tell a story. I think I would probably disagree because I think I rarely land on these kind of extreme sort of authoritative statements that Han seems very comfortable with. I at least want to know because I love social media. Like I've met really good friends through social media and just finding like-minded people. And someone once commented on one of my live streams that I used to do a while ago, this phrase algorithm angels. Just I don't know. I would like to consider the possibility that we can I mean, it's not that I don't have these dreams of just tossing my technology to someone who wants them and, like, trying to, like, live off the grid or something. I do. That's why I like Han as much as he frustrates me, and I like Heidegger, and I'm a bit of a Luddite sometimes. But I also think that if you can't get away, because there's sometimes, it's hard. Maybe some of us are creative enough to, like, figure it out, but the rest of us are not. And, I mean, I can't figure out how to live in Western Europe, even though I would like to. I don't know how to get past the visa situation. I don't know how to spend, zero time on technology. So I think sometimes you have to work with the situation that you're in. And I would like to know that it's possible to connect with people in meaningful ways. That it's possible to create content as art and enjoy the beauty of it and share that with others and make it a space for people to come together and chat. I do value community and intimacy and emotional depth. And at the same time, I love, taking photographs and beautiful pictures and images and sound and light and graphics. So can you marry those two things? Han is saying no, but I don't know. If I had an hour to chat with Han over some tea, I might try to get him to talk about this a bit and see what he thinks. Like, off book. A smartphone only allows for the accelerated exchange of information. Narrating presupposes close listening and deep attention. The narrative community is a community of attentive listeners, but we increasingly lack the patience for attentive listening, even the patience for narrative. When everything becomes contingent, fleeting, and accidental, and all that is binding and unifying dissolves, that is, in the current storm of contingency, there is a clamor for storytelling. The inflation of narrative betrays a need to be able to cope with contingency. But storytelling is unable to transform the information society, which is devoid of orientation and meaning, back into a stable narrative community. Rather, storytelling is a pathological phenomenon of our era. The narrative crisis has a long prehistory. This essay attempts to trace it. I wonder again if he's talking about, in that statement about storytelling, how it's pathological, if it's just how we're using storytelling now. I mean, I think Han, again, like, really wants a complete overhaul of our society. And that complete overhaul will make certain tasks, practices, realities possible that are just not possible in this reality, no matter how much you try to modify and tweak your life for your own aesthetic. I wonder if this is talking, because he does talk about therapy and psychology in other chapters. I wonder if he's talking about, like, the pathological storytelling we do about, like, maybe our trauma, or these stories of identity that we attach to, that we are just fighting for others to accept and recognize. I don't know. I mean, I think, if you have thoughts, let me know. All right, thank you so much for sticking with me, and please continue the conversation in the comments. I always respond. And yeah, have a good semester. Read philosophy. Let me know if you want me to read another chapter in this.